The terminal was buzzing with that specific kind of tired energy that only exists in an airport at 10 in the morning. It was a mix of caffeine jitters, sore feet, and the low hum of hundreds of conversations bouncing off the polished floors. People were rushing to gates, dragging wheeled bags that wobbled erratically, and shouting into phones about business meetings or delayed connections. In the middle of all this chaos stood a man who was used to being looked at, but who was currently doing his best to look like nobody at all. He was dressed in a way that was designed to disappear. A dark, heavy zip-up jacket that had seen better days, a pair of loose-fitting jeans, and scuffed boots. He wore a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead, casting a shadow across his face. If you looked closely, and most people were too busy rushing to their own lives to look closely, you would see the familiar jawline and the sad, dark eyes of Keanu Reeves. But he wasn't on a red carpet or a movie set right now. He was just a passenger holding a boarding pass for seat 14E on a standard, crowded commercial flight. He adjusted the strap of his backpack, feeling the weight of it on his shoulder. It wasn't a fancy leather bag. It was just a simple, durable nylon backpack that held his life for the next few days. He watched the electronic screen flicker above the gate agent's desk, waiting for his group to be called. He didn't ask for special treatment. He didn't stand at the front of the line demanding to be let on first. He just stood off to the side, leaning against a pillar, watching the flow of humanity with a quiet, patient gaze. A young woman walked by, talking loudly on her phone about a drama at work, almost bumping into him. He stepped aside gracefully, offering a small, silent nod of apology for being in her way, even though he hadn't moved an inch. Finally, the agent's voice cracked over the intercom, calling his group. He shuffled forward with the rest of the crowd, keeping his head down. He handed his pass to the agent. She scanned it, her eyes flicking up to his face, pausing for just a fraction of a second as recognition clicked in her brain. But he didn't wink or smile charmingly. He just gave a tired, polite half-smile and waited for her to hand the pass back. She didn't make a scene. She just nodded respectfully and let him through. It was a silent agreement that he was just another traveler trying to get home. Walking down the jet bridge was always a strange experience. The air grew stale and smelled faintly of recycled oxygen and jet fuel. The walls narrowed, funneling the crowd toward the plane entrance. When he stepped through the aircraft door, the temperature dropped significantly. The flight attendants were standing in their crisply pressed uniforms, greeting everyone with a practiced cheeriness that didn't quite reach their eyes. "Welcome aboard," one of them said as Keanu passed by. "Thank you," he replied. His voice was quiet, raspy, and sincere. He kept his eyes on the carpeted floor, counting the rows to find his spot. The economy cabin was already filling up. It was a tight squeeze. The overhead bins were becoming a battlefield of carry-on luggage, with passengers shoving and pushing to make sure their bags fit. Keanu found his row, 14, and paused. He had the aisle seat. The window seat was occupied by an older woman who was nervously clutching a knitting bag, looking terrified of the flying experience. The middle seat was still empty, which was a small stroke of luck. He stood in the aisle, blocking the flow of traffic for a moment as he prepared to lift his backpack into the compartment. He took off his jacket, revealing a simple t-shirt underneath, and folded it neatly. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't huffing or puffing about the delay he was causing the people behind him. He moved with a slow, deliberate calmness. Just as he reached up to place his bag in the compartment, he noticed a man a few rows back struggling. The man was trying to hoist a heavy, hard-shell suitcase into a bin that was already full. The suitcase was awkward, and the man was losing his grip. People behind him were starting to sigh loudly, checking their watches and rolling their eyes. The man's face turned red with embarrassment and effort. Without a second thought, Keanu stepped out of his own row and walked back. He didn't say anything. He just reached up. His hand steadied the man's bag, helping him guide it into a nearby empty slot. The man let out a breath of relief
and looked at his helper. He looked at Keanu's face, then down at his simple clothes, and his eyes went wide. You're him," he stammered, whispering. Keanu just smiled gently, a small crinkling at the corners of his eyes. "It fits better there," he said softly, pointing to the luggage. "Have a good flight." He turned around before the man could say anything else or pull out a phone for a selfie. He slipped back into row 14 and sat down in the aisle seat. The routine felt grounding. The metal buckle clicked into place with a satisfying snap. He leaned back, feeling the firm, uncomfortable pressure of the seat against his spine. It wasn't a plush recliner. There was no champagne waiting for him, just a stiff headrest and a safety card tucked in the pocket in front of him. He let out a long, slow breath. This was the part he liked, the anonymity. For the next few hours, nobody expected anything from him. He didn't have to be a hero or a villain or a celebrity. He could just be a guy sitting on a plane watching the ground crew throw bags onto the conveyor belt through the small, thick plastic window. The older woman in the window seat glanced at him, still clutching her knitting. She looked nervous. Keanu caught her eye and gave her a reassuring nod.
"It's a bit bumpy on the way up, but it smooths out," he said, his voice low and calming, just loud enough for her to hear. She relaxed her shoulders slightly. "Oh, thank you. I don't fly very often." "You'll be fine," he said. "Just breathe." He reached into his backpack and pulled out a battered paperback book. The spine was cracked and the pages were yellowed. It wasn't a script or a professional publication, just a story he wanted to get lost in. He opened it up, blocking out the rest of the world. The sound of the plane's air conditioning system whirred to life, a white noise that promised to drown out the world. Around him, the plane continued to fill. A businessman in a sharp suit walked down the aisle, talking loudly on his Bluetooth earpiece, complaining about a missed opportunity. A mother tried to soothe a crying baby a few rows back. A group of teenagers laughed at a video on a phone. It was a symphony of normal life, and Keanu was right in the middle of it, unseen and unbothered. He adjusted his baseball cap, pulling the brim down a little lower to shield his eyes from the reading light. He turned a page, his fingers rough and hands scarred from years of stunt work and motorcycle riding, but gentle with the book. He was just a silhouette in a sea of silhouettes, waiting for the heavy engines to roar to life, ready to be carried away into the sky. For now, the world outside the small plastic window didn't exist. There was only the smell of coffee, the hum of the plane, and the story unfolding in his hands. It was exactly where he wanted to be. The heavy mechanism of the plane door locking into place echoed through the cabin, signaling that there was no turning back. The bustling energy of the terminal was cut off instantly, leaving only the recycled air and the hum of the auxiliary power unit. Keanu kept his eyes on his book, but the words were starting to blur. The quiet bubble he had created for himself was about to be burst. He could sense a commotion coming down the aisle, a disruption in the flow of passengers finding their seats. A man in a gray suit was marching toward the back of the plane. He was moving with the kind of aggressive urgency that suggests a person believes they are the most important individual in the room. He was barking into a mobile phone, his voice sharp and cutting, slicing through the low murmur of the other passengers. He was sweating slightly, his forehead glistening under the harsh fluorescent lights, and his tie was loosened as if it were choking him. "I don't care about the protocol, Kevin. Just get it done," the man shouted into the receiver, not bothering to lower his voice even though he was now standing right next to row 14. "If this deal falls through, it's on your head, mine." He stopped abruptly at the empty middle seat next to Keanu. He looked at the seat, then at his watch, and let out a loud, exaggerated groan. He shoved his phone into his pocket and grabbed his garment bag from the overhead bin with a rough jerk, nearly hitting the older woman in the window seat. She flinched, pulling her knitting bag tighter to her chest. Keanu looked up, his body instinctively tensing. He watched as the man struggled to stuff the bag into the bin, huffing and puffing with frustration.
Finally, the man gave up on fitting it perfectly and just jammed it in, forcing the bin door shut with a bang that made the whole row of passengers jump. He turned to the aisle and squeezed past Keanu without a single word of apology. His elbow dug sharply into Keanu's shoulder as he maneuvered his bulk into the middle seat. He didn't say "excuse me" or "sorry." He just sat down, immediately spreading his knees wide so that his legs pressed against Keanu's thigh, claiming more than his share of the already cramped space. Keanu shifted his leg away, pressing it against the metal wall of the plane to make room. He tried to go back to his book, hoping the man would settle down, but the man was vibrating with anxiety. He pulled out his tablet and began stabbing at the screen with his finger, muttering curses under his breath. The air between them grew heavy and toxic. The nice lady in the window seat looked terrified. She stared straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge the man, trying to make herself as small as possible. "Can you believe the service on this airline?" the man barked out. He wasn't looking at anyone, just speaking to the air. "They put me in a middle seat. Me! After flying 200,000 miles this year. It's a joke!" Keanu didn't respond. He turned a page in his book, trying to focus on the printed words, but the man's energy was intrusive. It was like sitting next to a ticking bomb. The man shifted in his seat, bumping Keanu's arm again. "Hey, buddy, you mind moving your arm? You're taking up all the space." Keanu blinked. He looked down. His arm was resting perfectly on his own armrest. The man, however, had his arms crossed over his chest, his elbows sticking out into Keanu's side. Keanu didn't argue. He didn't want a scene. He quietly pulled his arm in closer to his body, folding his hands in his lap. He sacrificed his own comfort to keep the peace. "Thanks," the man grunted, though he said it like an insult. A few minutes passed. The plane began to push back from the gate. The flight attendant's voice came over the intercom, welcoming everyone and going through the safety procedures. As she spoke, the man in the gray suit finally stopped stabbing at his tablet and looked around the cabin, his eyes darting around as if looking for something to complain about. His gaze drifted over the older woman, then landed on the man sitting next to him.
He stared. He squinted his eyes, leaning in uncomfortably close. He was looking at Keanu's profile, at the shape of his nose, the scruff on his chin, the familiar slope of his forehead. The man's expression changed from annoyance to a sneer, a slow realization spreading across his face that turned into something ugly. "Wait a minute," the man said, his voice loud enough for the people in the row ahead to turn around. "I know you." Keanu froze. He slowly turned his head. He looked the man in the eye, his face calm but guarded. He didn't smile. He knew what was coming. It happened sometimes, but usually people were kind. This man was different. "You're that guy," the man said, pointing a finger at Keanu's chest. "You're that actor, Keanu something." Keanu gave a small, polite nod. "Yes, that's me." The man let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. He leaned back in his seat, throwing his hands up. "No way! I do not believe this. I get stuck in a tin can in the middle seat and I have to sit next to a movie star?" The sarcasm was thick and heavy. It wasn't a fan meeting a hero. It was a predator spotting prey. "What are you doing here?" the man asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Don't you guys have your own planes, or did you spend all your money on bad investments?" Keanu shifted uncomfortably. He could feel the eyes of the passengers around them boring into the back of his neck. "I just like to fly like everyone else," Keanu said softly. "It's no big deal." "It is a big deal," the man snapped, turning his body so he was fully facing Keanu. He ignored the safety demo happening at the front of the plane. "I paid good money for this ticket, and I have to sit next to, well, this." He gestured vaguely at Keanu, as if he were a piece of luggage. The man's eyes narrowed. He looked Keanu up and down, taking in the worn jacket and the simple t-shirt. "I haven't seen you in anything good lately. What happened? Did Hollywood finally figure out you can't act? Is that why you're flying coach? Because you're washed up?" The words hung in the air, sharp and cruel. The older woman in the window seat gasped quietly.
her hand going to her mouth. She looked at Keanu with deep sympathy. Keanu took a slow breath. He felt a flush of embarrassment rise up his neck, but he pushed it down. He didn't want to give this man the satisfaction of seeing him upset. He knew that the man's anger wasn't really about him. It was about the bad deal, the stressful morning, and the middle seat. Keanu was just a convenient target. "I'm sorry you feel that way," Keanu said, his voice steady and quiet. "I'm just trying to get to Los Angeles." "Yeah, well, keep your head down and maybe nobody will notice you," the man sneered. He pulled a magazine from the pocket in front of him and opened it aggressively, rustling the pages loudly. "Last thing I need is to be trapped next to a loser for 5 hours." He mumbled something else under his breath, something about sad eyes and boring movies, and then pretended to read. But Keanu could feel the man's leg bouncing against his, a constant irritating reminder of the hostility radiating from the seat next to him. The plane picked up speed, racing down the runway. The noise of the engines grew louder, roaring in their ears, but it wasn't loud enough to drown out the tension in row 14. Keanu stared straight ahead at the seatback in front of him. He didn't try to read his book anymore. He just sat there, his hands clasped tightly together, accepting the punishment of being a public figure in a private world. He had faced cameras and critics before, but it was different when you were shoulder to shoulder with them, trapped by a plastic seatbelt and 30,000 feet of empty air beneath you. The man in the gray suit huffed one last time, a sound of pure disgust, and closed his eyes, leaving Keanu to sit in the heavy, suffocating silence of his own company. The mechanical thud of the fastened seatbelt sign switching off echoed through the cabin, releasing a collective sigh of relief from the passengers. The plane had leveled out at cruising altitude, the roar of the engine settling into a steady, hypnotic thrum that vibrated gently through the floorboards. The man in the gray suit unbuttoned his jacket with a sharp tug, letting out a loud, dramatic exhale, as if he had just finished a marathon, rather than sitting still for 20 minutes. He immediately reached for the call button over his head, pressing it repeatedly and impatiently until a flight attendant hurried over. He ordered a double scotch, his voice demanding and loud, treating the attendant less like a person, more like a vending machine. When the drink arrived, he gulped half of it down in one swallow, the ice clinking aggressively against the plastic cup as he lowered it. Then he turned his attention back to the only form of entertainment he had left, the quiet man sitting next to him. Keanu had managed to read the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing a single word. He could feel the man's eyes on him, heavy and judgmental. He tried to shift his focus back to the page, hoping the man would just drink his drink and fall asleep. But the alcohol didn't relax the man. It only seemed to sharpen his edges. He was bored, and boredom made him cruel. "You know," the man started, his voice slurring slightly, but carrying a nasty edge, "I saw you in that Matrix movie, the first one. It was okay, I guess, but you just sort of stood there looking confused." Keanu didn't look up. He kept his eyes on the paper, though his jaw tightened just a fraction. It was a subtle reaction, visible only if one were looking closely at the muscle twitching beneath his skin.
"Hey, I'm talking to you," the man said, nudging Keanu's arm with his elbow, harder this time. It wasn't a friendly nudge, it was a poke meant to provoke. "Is it true you give all your money away? I heard that on the news, that you're some kind of saint or something." Keanu sighed very softly, a sound of resignation. He turned the page of his book, even though he hadn't finished the previous one. "I just try to do what I can," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "Yeah, right, it's all for show," the man scoffed. He swirled the remaining liquid in his cup. "Guys like you think you're better than everyone else because you pretend to be humble, but I see you. You're sitting here in a hoodie, acting like you don't want to be noticed. It's a game. You're desperate for attention." The irony of the statement was lost on the man. He was the one demanding attention, shouting into the void of the economy cabin. The tension in row 14 was becoming physical. It felt like the air pressure had dropped, squeezing the lungs of everyone sitting nearby. The elderly woman in the window seat had squeezed her eyes shut, her fingers white-knuckled around her rosary beads. She wasn't praying for the flight, she was praying for the conversation to stop. But the man wasn't done. He sensed that his attacks on Keanu's career weren't getting the reaction he wanted. He wanted to see a crack in the armor. He wanted to see the famous actor break. So he decided to aim lower, hitting below the belt where he knew it would hurt the most. "I read an article about you a while back," the man said, leaning in closer. His breath smelled of cheap alcohol. "Terrible luck you've had. Really tragic." He paused, waiting for Keanu to look at him. When Keanu finally turned his head, his eyes were dark and unreadable, a calm mask hiding a deep ocean of pain. "Losing a kid? That's rough," the man said, his voice dropping to a cruel whisper. "And then your wife? Or was it your girlfriend? I can't keep track. It seems like everyone around you dies, doesn't it?" The silence that followed was absolute. It was a shocking violation of social norms, a cruel thing to say to a stranger, let alone to a man who had lived through that unimaginable grief. A few rows ahead, a passenger turned around, their face a mask of disbelief. The man in the gray suit didn't care. He felt a rush of power from seeing the flicker of hurt in Keanu's eyes. "I read an article about you a while back," the man said, leaning in closer. His breath smelled of cheap alcohol. "Terrible luck you've had. Really tragic." He paused, waiting for Keanu to look at him. When Keanu finally turned his head, his eyes were dark and unreadable, a calm mask hiding a deep ocean of pain. "Losing a kid? That's rough," the man said, his voice dropping to a cruel whisper. "And then your wife? Or was it your girlfriend? I can't keep track. It seems like everyone around you dies, doesn't it?" The silence that followed was absolute. It was a shocking violation of social norms, a cruel thing to say to a stranger, let alone to a man who had lived through that unimaginable grief. A few rows ahead, a passenger turned around, their face a mask of disbelief. The man in the gray suit didn't care. He felt a rush of power from seeing the flicker of hurt in Keanu's eyes. "Is that why you always play such sad characters? Method acting? Or are you just miserable all the time? Maybe it's you. Maybe you're the problem. Ever think of that? Bad things happen to people who deserve it." It was a vile thing to say. It was the kind of comment that makes your stomach turn, revealing a darkness in the bully's soul that went far beyond simple grumpiness. He was attacking the very heart of a man who had known more sorrow than most people could endure. Keanu didn't shout. He didn't punch the man, though every muscle in his body was rigid with the effort to stay still. He slowly closed his book. He placed it gently on his lap, his hands resting on the cover, fingers intertwining to stop them from shaking. He looked at the man, really looked at him, not with anger, but with a profound sadness that seemed to see right through the man's expensive suit and empty words. "That is a terrible thing to say to anyone," Keanu said quietly. His voice wasn't weak. It was steady, filled with a quiet dignity that made the bully's grin falter. "I hope you find some peace in your life." The man bristled, his face turning a splotchy red. He hated being pitied. He wanted Keanu to fight back, to yell, to prove that he was just another jerk in Hollywood. But Keanu wouldn't give him that satisfaction. "Don't psychoanalyze me, you actor," the man spat, turning away and slamming his plastic cup down on the tray table, causing the remaining ice to jump out. "You don't know anything about me." "You're right, I don't," Keanu said simply. He turned his head toward the window, looking out at the endless expanse of clouds glowing in the sunlight. He was done engaging. He realized that there was nothing he could say that would change this man's heart. The man was poisoned by his own bitterness, and spitting that venom at Keanu was the only way he knew to make himself feel big. The cabin felt incredibly small. The air felt heavy and stale. The passengers nearby were no longer just uncomfortable. They were angry. They had witnessed a public shaming, a moment of pure malice directed at someone who had shown nothing but kindness. The man in the gray suit sat fuming, scrolling aggressively through his phone, his knee bouncing up and down, hitting Keanu's leg with every jolt. But Keanu didn't move this time. He sat rooted to the spot, staring out the window, a solitary figure absorbing the turbulence of the world around him with a silence that spoke louder than any shout ever could. He was hurt, deeply, but he refused to let that hurt turn into hate. He just held on to the armrests and waited for the flight to be over. Pushing the heavy metal cart was a senior flight attendant. She had short, silver hair and a face that showed years of smiling through turbulence, delays, and rude travelers. She had seen it all in her 30 years in the sky. She knew the difference between a passenger who was just grumpy because of a lack of legroom and a passenger who was genuinely cruel. As she got closer to row 14, she slowed her pace. She felt the change in the air before she even saw the faces. The tension was so thick, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the aisle. She stopped the cart just a few feet short of the row. She took a moment to observe. She saw the older woman in the window seat staring intently at her knitting, her hands shaking slightly. She saw the man in the gray suit, his face flushed red, scrolling aggressively on his phone with his jaw set tight. And then she looked at the man in the aisle seat. He was staring out the window, his profile still and sad, his hands resting loosely on his closed book. The flight attendant had watched the boarding process earlier. She had seen this actor help another passenger with a bag without asking for thanks. She knew who he was. Most of the crew did. They had a silent rule about him. Leave him be. Treat him like a human, not a prize. But now, seeing him sitting next to this aggressive man, she realized that leaving him be wasn't the right call anymore. She had overheard the nasty comments about his past while she was organizing the drinks in the galley. Her blood was boiling. The man in the gray suit looked up as the cart blocked his view of the cabin. He didn't even wait for a greeting. "Finally," he barked, slamming his phone down onto his tray table. "I've been waiting forever. Get me a double scotch, and make sure it's from the mini bottle. I don't want that cheap stuff from the tap." The flight attendant didn't move to get the drink. She didn't write it down on her pad. Instead, she stood tall, placing her hands on the handle of the cart and looked him directly in the eye. Her gaze wasn't the submissive customer service look he expected. It was firm, unyielding, and disappointed. "Sir," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the cabin noise, "I will get to you in a moment." The man scoffed, incredulous. "Excuse me? I asked for a drink. I'm sitting right here. What is your problem?" She ignored his question completely. She leaned past him, deliberately blocking him out, and focused her attention on the quiet man in the aisle seat. Her expression softened instantly, transforming from stern to warmly protective. "Mr. Reeves," she said gently. Keanu turned his head slowly, his eyes guarded. "I couldn't help but overhear the conversation back here, and I have to say, I am deeply sorry for the way you were being treated." The man in the suit let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Oh, give me a break. Are you serious? He's a big boy. He can handle a little conversation." The flight attendant turned on him then, her eyes flashing. She didn't raise her voice, but the authority in her tone made the man shrink back into his seat. "You will be quiet, sir. I am speaking to a passenger." She looked back at Keanu. "We actually have a few empty seats in business class today. It's not full. We would be honored to have you move up there. You've had enough of this for one day." It was a bold move. Offering an upgrade in the middle of a flight based on a behavioral issue wasn't standard protocol, but she didn't care. She was driven by a basic human instinct to defend someone who was being kicked while he was down. Keanu looked at her, really seeing her, and a small, genuine smile touched his lips. It was the first real smile he had shown since boarding. He appreciated the gesture more than he could say, but then he looked around the cabin. He saw the people watching. He knew that if he moved now, it would make a scene. It would embarrass the man further, and as angry as the man made him, Keanu didn't want to be the cause of a public humiliation. He shook his head slightly, speaking softly. "Thank you. That is incredibly kind of you. Really. But I'm all right here. I don't want to cause any trouble." "You aren't the one causing trouble," the flight attendant said, her voice firm. She looked back at the man in the gray suit, who was now sputtering with indignation. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, his voice rising. "I want to speak to your supervisor. You're ignoring a paying customer to coddle some celebrity who thinks he's too good to sit in coach?" The flight attendant reached down and placed a bottle of water on Keanu's tray table with deliberate care. Then she turned her full attention to the man in the gray suit. She leaned in close, lowering her voice so that only he, Keanu, and the window seat passenger could hear. It was more terrifying than if she had shouted. "Listen to me and listen closely," she said, her tone icy. "I have served actors, CEOs, presidents, and families on this plane for 30 years. I know the difference between a man who has earned his seat and a man who just thinks he owns the world. Mr. Reeves has more class, grace, and humility in his little finger than you have in your entire body." The man opened his mouth to argue, but she held up a hand to stop him. "I saw you help that man with the bag earlier," she continued, nodding toward Keanu. "I didn't see you demand a thank you. I didn't see you complain about the crowd. You just helped. That is a gentleman. You are nothing but a bully. And if you open your mouth to insult him or anyone else on this plane one more time, I will have the waiting police meet us at the gate. You will be removed from this aircraft in handcuffs for causing a disturbance. Do you understand me?"
The silence in the surrounding rows was absolute. The other passengers were holding their breath, silently cheering. The color drained from the man's face. He looked from the stern face of the flight attendant to the calm, unmoving face of the actor next to him. He realized he was outmatched. He had lost the room. "Fine," the man mumbled, his voice stripped of its earlier bravado. He picked up his phone, refusing to look at anyone. "Whatever." "Good," she said, her voice returning to a normal volume. "I'll be back with your water in a few minutes. Perhaps you can use the time to think about how to speak to people." She gave Keanu one last warm pat on the shoulder, a silent signal of solidarity, and pushed the cart toward the next row. As she moved away, the pressure in the cabin seemed to lift. The man in the gray suit sat rigid in his seat, staring at the screen of his phone that he wasn't actually reading. Keanu took a sip of the water she had given him. It was cold and refreshing. He looked out the window again, but this time his shoulders weren't quite so tense. The darkness had been pushed back, if only for a moment, by someone brave enough to use her voice. The silence that settled over row 14 was heavy, but it was different now. It wasn't the suffocating weight of cruelty. It was the quiet aftermath of a storm that had finally broken. The man in the gray suit sat slumped in his seat, his body language completely changed. He was hunched over, shrinking into himself, trying desperately to occupy as little space as possible. The arrogant energy that had radiated from him earlier had vanished, replaced by a sullen, embarrassed stillness. He kept his eyes glued to his phone, swiping mindlessly through screens, refusing to look up, refusing to acknowledge the world around him. Keanu sat beside him, calm and composed. The tension in his shoulders had melted away after the flight attendant's intervention. He took a slow sip of the water she had given him, the cold liquid soothing his dry throat. He didn't look at the man next to him. He didn't gloat or smile in victory. He simply accepted the peace that had been restored to the space. The elderly woman in the window seat shifted slightly. She looked at Keanu, her eyes wide with admiration and relief. She reached out a trembling hand and gently patted his forearm. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the engine's drone, "for being so patient. You are a good man." Keanu turned to her, his face softening. He placed his hand over hers for a brief second, a warm and grounding gesture. "We're just trying to get home, same as everyone else," he replied softly. "It will be okay." The rest of the flight passed in a strange, calm haze. The cabin crew made a point of walking past row 14 more often than necessary, offering extra snacks, checking on the elderly lady, and casting protective glances toward Keanu. It was a silent, united front. The other passengers who had heard the commotion were now stealing glances at the back of the cabin, shaking their heads at the man in the suit, treating him like a ghost. It was a powerful reminder that while one person can be loud and mean, the majority of people generally value kindness and respect. Hours later, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the initial descent. The fasten seatbelt sign dinged on, bathing the cabin in an orange glow. The man in the gray suit didn't try to make any more phone calls. He didn't complain about the landing. He just stared out the window, watching the ground rise up to meet them, looking like a child who had been sent to the corner. As the wheels touched the tarmac with a screech and a thud, the plane rattled and slowed. The passengers erupted into the usual chatter of finding bags and making calls. The seatbelt sign clicked off, and the aisles immediately filled with people standing up and stretching. The man in the gray suit was the first one up in his row. He grabbed his garment bag from the overhead bin, nearly dropping it in his haste. He didn't say, "Excuse me." He didn't look at Keanu. He didn't look at the woman. He just shoved his way into the aisle, clutching his bag, and power-walked toward the front of the plane, keeping his head down, desperate to escape the scene of his embarrassment. He wanted to disappear, to be invisible, which was exactly what Keanu wanted at the start of the flight. Keanu waited. He let the rush of people subside. He stood up slowly, stretching his back. He reached for his backpack, checking the pocket to make sure his book was safely tucked away. He helped the elderly lady lift her knitting bag down from the bin, holding it steady while she slid the strap over her shoulder. "You take care now," he said to her. "You too, dear, and ignore people like that. They aren't happy." He nodded. "I know."
When he reached the front galley, where the pilots were saying goodbye to the passengers, the silver-haired flight attendant was waiting. She was standing with her arms crossed, but her face broke into a warm, genuine smile when she saw him. She stepped out of the way of the other passengers to block his path for just a moment. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "I meant what I said back there. I'm sorry we couldn't move you, but I'm glad you stayed." Keanu looked at her, really looking at her. He saw the tiredness in her eyes, but also the strength. "You didn't have to do that," he said softly, "but it meant a lot. Thank you for standing up for me, and for her." He gestured back toward the cabin where the elderly lady was still shuffling along. "It was my pleasure," she said, reaching out and gently squeezing his hand. "You handle yourself with a lot of grace. Don't ever let anyone take that away from you." "I'll try," he smiled. It was a full, warm smile that reached his eyes. "Have a good rest of your day," she said, stepping aside. "You too," he replied. He walked down the jet bridge, his boots thumping lightly on the metal flooring. The air was cooler here, smelling of airport carpet and jet fuel. He walked into the busy terminal, blending instantly into the crowd. There were no flashes of cameras, no screaming fans, no drama. He was just a man in a jacket, carrying a backpack, walking toward the baggage claim. The incident on the plane felt like a distant memory already, but the feeling of the flight attendant's hand on his shoulder lingered. It was a reminder that even in a world where people could be cruel and angry, there were always guardians, people who would use their voice to protect the quiet ones. He adjusted his backpack strap, took a deep breath of the terminal air, and kept walking. He was just Keanu, heading home, carrying his dignity and the memory of a small victory for kindness.